Good morning. Looks like we have the early birds here today. That's great. Thank you for joining us. So we're going to start off today with, for those of you who've already been at the 8:30 sessions this morning, that's great. But today I'm going to welcome to the stage Adam Pennington, who is the attack lead at MITRE. So Adam leads attack at the MITRE Corporation and collected much of the intelligence leveraged in creating attacks' initial techniques. He has spent much of those 13 years with MITRE studying and preaching the use of deception for intelligence gathering. Prior to joining MITRE, Adam was a researcher at Carnegie Mellon's Parallel Data Lab and earned his BS and MS degrees in computer science and electrical and computer engineering, as well as the 2017 Alumni Service Award from Carnegie Mellon University. Adam has presented and is published in a number of venues, including First CTI, USENIX Security, DEF CON, and ACME transactions on information and system security. So please welcome Adam to the stage with Bringing Intelligence into Cyber Deception with MITRE Attack.
Thank you. And good morning, Cayman. So as Jane just said in my lovely introduction, my name is Adam Pennington. I'm going to be talking about something a little bit different this morning. I'm going to be talking about cyber deception, and I'm going to be talking about using a framework called MITRE Attack to do a lot of the planning around it. If you haven't heard of MITRE, we're a United States not-for-profit working in the public interest, been around about 60 years. And everything I'm going to be talking about today is free and open source. So some of this was just in my introduction, so I'm not going to belabor it. I run the MITRE Attack framework that I'll be getting into in a little bit. I've been with MITRE for quite a while at this point, with a focus on threat intelligence and deception. So today, this talk is bringing two of my favorite topics together. I've been in the trenches in the past. I wasn't always managing a sort of database of adversary activities. I've been in security operations centers as well as a threat intelligence analysis. And I've been involved with the attack framework itself since it was first created as an Excel spreadsheet. Some of my excitement in seeing BSides Cayman Islands come to pass is that I'm also a scuba diver. I've been coming down to Cayman for 16 years to dive. I have over 400 hours of bottom time in the Cayman Islands. So the journey that I'm planning to take through the rest of this talk, I'm going to talk about classical deception, some of what we've known how to do now for thousands of years in warfare and intelligence planning, how we can bring that into cybersecurity. I'm going to show how we can use attack to start building up the intelligence we need to be able to do some of this planning, work through a methodology for doing deception planning in cybersecurity, and then leave you with some takeaways. So just to get us all on the same page, I want to start with the dictionary definition of deception. Deception is the act of causing somebody to accept as true or valid what is false or invalid. In short, it's lying to somebody with the intent on them believing it. And so we're going to try to use lying for good for the purposes of cybersecurity. Deception is not a new concept, and I promise, despite on the slide, I have no Sun Tzu quotes in my talk. But deception's been in warfare for a very long time, written about by Sun Tzu thousands of years ago. It truly came into its own during World War II with things like the British double cross system, events like the Man Who Never Was, where the Brits floated a dead body ashore off of Spain. Or people watch Netflix, Operation Mincemeat. During the Cold War, a lot of practices around deception became codified, and we learned how to do this a bit better. And so people like Barton Whaley talked about different mechanisms for doing it. It's not that new in cybersecurity either. So in 1989, a book was published called The Cuckoo's Egg, where Cliff Stoll talked about the actions of a Russian hacker as they worked their way through different computers, mostly in the United States. And one of the things that he did during the course of this was to put the hacker in a fake environment to see what they did. And incidentally, MITRE has a role in the story. We were one of the companies hacked. The HoneyNet project started in 1999, and they've done a lot of terrific work putting out open source tools, putting out instructions and tales on things that can be done with honeypotting and in the deception space. And it's become a product space too. So people are starting to make money on this as well. I'm not going to be talking about any products today, but it's become an area such that even Gartner is looking, comparing, and stacking different deception solutions. So we don't usually talk about deception. I think I'm the first person to mention the word at BSides at least. So why use it in cybersecurity? Well, it lets us do some things that we can't do with normal defensive mechanisms. So for one, we can increase ambiguity for an adversary. We can cause somebody who has successfully broken into an environment, has access to the crown jewels, all the data, to ask themselves, is this information real? To doubt that the material that they've stolen is even what they wanted. You can get them to ask things like, am I on the right network? And am I where I intended to actually hack today? Now, my focus and where a lot of my planning is going to be talking about today is on gathering data on an adversary. So trying to put an adversary in a fake environment to ask yourself, how does an adversary look when they think that they've hacked us? And finally, it can even be used for things like discrediting the adversary. So in 2016, the Russians hacked the USDNC, political campaigns, and leaked a lot of information related to the 2016 campaign. The French saw this, and in 2017, the Macron campaign inserted a bunch of fake emails into their own email spools. And so when Russians then hacked and leaked a bunch of the emails from the campaign was able to point out, see, a lot of this is fake. It's sort of obviously fake. Why can you trust any of this? And it worked. And so to this day, you don't really know which of those materials were true and which were plants. So MITRE's doing other work in deception space. I wanted to give a shout out to some of my colleagues with another free tool that's out there that was released in final a couple months ago called MITRE Engage. So this gets into a broader set of options than I'm going to be really covering today, but just wanted to show some of the scope of work in this space. The way Engage is organized is that it starts with what you're trying to do to the adversary. Are you trying to find out that they're on a network, expose them? Are you trying to change how they operate and affect them? Or are you trying to gather intelligence about them or elicit information? It gets into the broad deception categories that you're going to use to actually do that, and then specific techniques that you can put against the adversary. And again, they've put out a bunch of free resources at their website. A number of them actually work hand in hand with some of the processes I'm going to be working on today. And these came out just a couple months ago. So that's some of the tooling that's out there, some of the things to gather information on options in deception. But what are some of the terms you might have already heard in this space? So most of the work today is not focused on disinformation, trying to discredit the adversary. Most today is focused on either trying to expose the adversary, which I often call deception for detection. So trying to find that an adversary is actually on your network as they trip over something. And so this could be something like honeypots. Many of you are probably familiar with the term already. Honey tokens, so placing fake information around your network and hoping that it gets touched. Also have a long history, back to the cuckoo's egg, of deception for intelligence gathering, what Engage calls elicitation. And so these are things like honeypots, honeynets, where we're building up bigger systems. A lot of people don't like the term honeypot, so we've started to see deception environments, but it's really all the same thing. And so a lot of options here, lots of tools. Which of these is appropriate for you? Well, I'm an intelligence person, and a common answer for any intelligence analyst is, it depends. Some types of engagements, some of these types of systems require a lot more adversary understanding than others. You might need to know, who it is that's coming after you, what they've seen in the past, how they tend to operate. And it's important not to put some of these options in the way of doing basic hygiene. If you don't already have things like multi-factor authentication, patching, maybe it's not time yet to start diving down deception. Some of these are also much more accessible and lower risk than others. Scattering fake data around your network and watching to see if it gets touched is not very risky. There's some risk that somebody accidentally stumbles over it, thinks that they've found some information that they shouldn't have. You might have false positives, but there isn't much risk in it getting out. Doing a full-blown honeypot and putting an adversary in it intentionally, trying to get them to operate for weeks or months at a time, can have some risk if you haven't taken proper precautions. Everything from government agencies thinking that you've been hacked, to the press finding out and announcing that you've had a recent breach. But if done correctly, the reward can be high. You can gather tons of intelligence about what adversaries are doing in the wild. So I've been doing this for a while, but we actually still see some fairly common problems in how both products and open source tooling are being used in deception. Primary two that I see are, first, mismatched visibility. The capabilities are not where the adversaries are looking. So if I have an adversary that it only targets Active Directory to find other systems, the way they get in is they dump the entire LDAP out of Active Directory, look for systems in there, and I've just bought a product that the only way an adversary can find it is by port scanning. Well, the adversary is not deceived because they can't even find it. And this actually happens fairly commonly. The other area we see is mismatched expectations. So the capabilities don't look like what an adversary expects to find in that type of environment. So say our capability just has a single local account because we're spinning up a virtual machine or a system right before we're running an adversary in it. And the password was changed 5 minutes ago as we built out the virtual machine. Well, if we have an adversary that looks for a lot of well-established accounts, they expect accounts to have been around for weeks or months, then we might be in trouble trying to actually convince them of anything. So we know how to do deception. We've been doing it, since the BC era. We've been doing it in the cyberspace for this many years. And so what's still going wrong? A lot of it comes down to mirror imaging. Mirror imaging is a cognitive bias that is common in intelligence analysis. So mirror imaging is the idea that we are naturally wired to assume that our adversary thinks like we do. And so in some spaces, the process of saying, well, if I was an adversary, what I would do is X can be really helpful for sort of expanding the options, getting into it, but it can be dangerous in intelligence analysis. So quoting from Richard Heuer, mirror imaging leads to dangerous assumptions because people in other cultures do not think the way we do. And in cybersecurity, it gets beyond that too. Our adversaries may have different constraints than us. They may have rules that are given to them by supervisors that a red team or a pen tester doesn't have. They may have tools that are easily accessible to them. They may or may not have things that are easy for them to do. And so we need to be careful about how we make our assumptions. And this is something that we've known how to do, again, for quite a while. We've done formal deception planning in other intelligence areas for decades in order to get around things like our mirror imaging bias. And so up front, before we do deception in the normal non-cyberspace, we always research the adversary. We want to understand to the best of our ability, our adversaries' preconceptions, expectations, and reactions. What do they think they're going to find when they break into a network? What is it they're going to do if they find specific things? And all of that comes before we start getting into designing a deception. So there's this tendency to want to put the technology first and then figure out what to do with it. But that can be really dangerous in this space where you need to actually match your adversary rather than the other way around. So, you get into designing your deception where you're building out a cover story, what it is that you're supposed to look like to an adversary. Determine what it is you need to hide from them to be successful, what it is you need to actually create and show them. Develop your full plan. So figure out what you need to do in terms of denial and deception. I'll be getting into each of these steps. Deploy it, and then finally monitor and control. Get it out there. So that first step is understanding the adversary, building up a profile of what it is our adversary expects, how they're going to react. And so traditional deception planning is a very intelligence-driven process. So we can apply a similar process to cyber deception, but as defenders, we're likely not going to know preconceptions and expectations directly. We don't get to walk up to the ransomware group that's trying to break into us and say, hey, when you hack me next week, what do you think you're going to find 5 minutes into the operation? It would be super nice, but it's just not how the world works. And so we can infer a lot of this based on how they behave and how they behaved in other systems. So we need to build up this intelligence picture. And so that's what I'm going to be using ATT&CK for today. Incidentally, taken off of West Bay in 2019, teaching a crab underwater about ATT&CK. So I'm going to get into a couple minutes just running down a ATT&CK 101 if you haven't used it before I start using it in my talk. What is ATT&CK? At its core, it's a knowledge base of adversary behaviors. It's like an encyclopedia of things that adversaries have done in the real world. So it's focused on these real world observations, things that have been done in real intrusions rather than things that have just been seen from pen testers or red teams. And we think there's some value in the focus that brings into specific behaviors. It's free, open, and globally accessible. You can use it, you can fork it, you can put it in commercial products. It's all okay by us. It's a common language. So a lot of governments and companies these days are putting out the reporting, leveraging ATT&CK. It's everything from the US government, UK government, New Zealand, Australia. The Russian FSB uses ATT&CK in some of their reporting. So it's become a common language over time. It's community driven. Most of the material we add to ATT&CK comes from people sending us emails saying, hey, you missed this thing over here. And we add it, and it becomes part of the knowledge base for everyone else to use. If you've seen ATT&CK before, this is sort of the view that most people are used to. It's what we call the matrix. So it's going to be a little bit too small, so I'm just showing the shape here, really. Across the top, we have what we call tactics. These are the adversary's technical goals at a high level. So things like initial access, adversaries trying to get into my network, or exfiltration, the adversary sending data out of my network. Underneath each of these, we have these cells that we call techniques. The techniques are how the goals are achieved. So instead of something broad like initial access, we might have a technique like phishing. This view hides another layer of techniques called sub-techniques. So underneath a lot of these, we have things like instead of phishing, we have spear phishing attachments. So an adversary sent a malicious email with a malicious attachment attached to it. And finally, inside each of these techniques, we have procedures. So if you're used to tactics, techniques, and procedures, it matches. And so procedures are specific ways that adversaries have accomplished a technique. So instead of spear phishing attachment, we have APT12 has sent emails of malicious Office documents with PDFs attached. Behind each technique and each sub-technique, There's an English language description getting into, from an adversary point of view, how the technique is actually accomplished, technical details about it, some of the varieties of it been seen in the past. There's metadata. This technique ID is what a lot of people use when I refer to that common language, that T1566001, as well as other information for centering the technique. And it also includes a bunch of defensive information on how to detect or mitigate the technique, which is not the material I'm using today. Some pieces I am using today, though, are attack tracks a number of threat groups in public. And so over 100 different threat groups, we've tracked open source published intelligence about them and information about the behaviors they've done. So again, we have a description of the group, various metadata about them. Something I know a lot of people use ATT&CK for, which is associated group descriptions. So different companies have different visibility over overlapping activity and naturally use different names to describe it. So one person's oil rig is another person's Cobalt Gypsy, is another person's Helix Kitten, is Mandiant's APT24. And all of these have citations back to where the linkage is for that group name. Keep track of the techniques used by each of these and the software that each of these groups is using, and some of the same reporting and the techniques that those pieces of software are using. And finally, we back it all up with references. We show our work. We have over 3,000 references in ATT&CK, so that if you don't trust us, you can go in, actually see the same reports and see if you agree with how we've brought them in. I think I just jumped like 3 ahead. Really does not like that slide. Can you advance it? Thank you. Yeah, it's probably because the slide's too large. But so I'm going to be covering deception the rest of this talk. This is not the way that ATT&CK is normally used. The way we see most people use it is for organizing their detections, what sorts of behaviors they're able to see on their end systems. We commonly see it used in threat intelligence, looking at different adversaries, what sorts of activities they're going to be doing, that I am going to be using today. People do a lot of work with assessment and engineering, figuring out their overall scope of what they can see. And the reason we created ATT&CK in the first place was actually for adversary emulation, building up for a red team a profile of what an adversary looks like so that the red team can operate in a similar fashion. Okay, we've got our pieces. We've got classic deception. We've got ATT&CK that I'm going to use for building up the intelligence. Let's get into actually doing some cyber deception planning. So I have an intelligence-driven cyber deception planning process that is based closely on the classic deception process I showed you earlier. So this starts out with a step 0 that we don't have in classic deception planning, which is determining who your priority adversaries are. So this is a space where cyber is a bit different. In classical deception planning, we tend to know who it is we want to deceive right off the bat. So if we're at war with somebody, it's whoever we're at war with. You know, we might know what specific foreign countries. We often don't know who's hacking us, or we might have a lot of people hacking us that we need to think about at the same time. So it's a little bit of added work that we have in the cyberspace. We're going to build an adversary profile based on cyber threat intelligence. What do we know about an adversary? What do we know about how they operate? We're going to develop a cover story. We're going to determine what information needs to be hidden from the adversary and what false information needs to be revealed to them to match this cover story. We're going to design and build the technical capability, deploy it, gather intelligence, and then back to step 0 to start all over again. So step 0, determine who your priority adversaries are. This is actually something important way beyond just doing something like deception planning. If you're looking at intelligence about your adversaries, you need to decide where to start, or you're just going to have paralysis. There are a lot of ways to do this, though. Some ideas that you might take away from, maybe you want to focus on an adversary who targets you regularly. Maybe there's somebody who spearfishes you on the first Tuesday of every month, and you'd really like to know why. Maybe it's an adversary who's targeted other people like you. So I see Foster's here. Maybe you've got an adversary that targets Kirk or other supermarkets on the island, and you're really curious, what it is you might be missing here. Maybe it's the adversary that keeps you up at night. Who is it that you're really afraid of? You think they're going to overwhelm your existing defenses. Or maybe it's just who you've got an intelligence gap about. You're really curious about a particular adversary. There's sort of no wrong answer here. It needs to be based on your own priorities. I'm going to use for the rest of this talk the adversary who keeps you up at night. So I'm going to be using for my examples Turla. Turla is a claimed to be Russian actor that has been active a long, long time, since at least the 90s, and is often one of the first users of really advanced technical techniques. So I'm going to build up an adversary profile based on cyber threat intelligence. And again, there are some different ways to do this. I'm going to follow just going through information that ATT&CK has released. And I'm going to do this for building up a profile, but building up attack techniques for a specific adversary. And so we've given a lot of information that you can use to do this for free. If you go to ATT&CK's group pages, where we built up profiles for over 100 adversaries based on mapping open source public threat intelligence reports that we've already analyzed. But you can also do your own. There's a lot of open source intelligence reports out there. There's no way we get to all of them. You can use the intelligence that you've paid for. A lot of you probably have commercial CTI providers, that are going to be information that you can't just get out on the open network. Put that to use. You actually add that into your intelligence picture. If you have your own threat intelligence, if you have previous encounters with an adversary, absolutely use it. We a lot of times see people using just the information from ATT&CK or just free information, not using the information they already know, which is probably better. It's what you have that you know about your own space. So when I'm talking about mapping from these public threat intelligence reports, this is the process I'm talking about. So this is an example report from 2018 done by the NCC group on APT-15. So just getting in, it's all prose. It's not written in any sort of structured language. And what we're doing behind the scenes and what you can do with your own threat intelligence reporting, we're going through, we're identifying behaviors in here, so the highlights in yellow, and then we're figuring out what attack techniques map to them. So creating batch scripts is Windows Command Shell T105903. Creating Windows run keys is register run key startup folder T1574001. And we can go through and do this. Now, it isn't going to be something that you can just do off the top of your head. You're just going to sit down and go, I know it's T1059003. But there are structured processes for doing this. We've put out training online for free. It's been out for a couple of years through both YouTube and Cybersecurity. It's free either way. And we worked with Department of Homeland Security, CISA, to put out a guide that actually also walks through a process of doing this. So back to that matrix view. I'm taking all of the techniques that we have out there in public on the groups page for Turla. So this is the picture we have. Again, not to focus on the specific techniques, it's small. I'll zoom in on some portions in a little bit, but just to show you the shape of it. So some things we can gather just by looking at the field of blue here. We can see that there's blue under a lot of different tactics. So maybe we've got an intel picture that's giving us an idea of what an adversary is doing on multiple parts of an intrusion. That's probably good. And you can see that we've got some breadth as well under a lot of the different tactics here. We know a lot of the different ways they're doing. You see a lot under discovery, which is absolutely critical for doing deception. And so I'll dive into some of those tactics in just a second. So I said we wanted preconceptions and expectations, but that's behaviors. How are we getting from one to another? We can do a lot of inference here. Now, there's danger in doing that. We're inserting our own opinions. We're inserting a new risk of bias here. But again, we're unlikely to have that direct intelligence. We can't ask the adversary, what do you think? So say, for example, we see that Turla does browser bookmark discovery. What that means is that they're going in and dumping a local web browser's bookmarks, stealing them, taking them back home. What can we infer from that? Let's start with the obvious. They assume that there's a browser, at least on some of the systems that they're hacking. The adversary assumes that there's a browser that has bookmarks. Okay, that's pretty obvious, but it's told us something. But something maybe a little bit deeper. The adversary probably expects an interactive user. You don't have browser bookmarks on many servers. You don't have people sitting down and doing that kind of activity. So maybe they assume a interactive user, something we consider as we build for them. Another technique is that the adversary uses virtualization/sandbox evasion. Basically, if they see the presence of a virtual machine, they bug out. What does that tell us? Well, they probably expect not to be in a virtual machine if they're in the place they want to be. And this can actually be hard for honeypotting because the natural thing is to build up a lot of virtual machines. And obviously, it also tells us that they have some belief that a virtual machine might be bad. It's probably because they've gotten caught in the sandbox before. And in a lot of cases, they're actually looking specifically for VirtualBox. So you see some of the evidence of past sandbox interaction. So we can do that across the different techniques we've seen, but it's time to start developing a cover story. A cover story is what the target of the deception should perceive and believe. It's not something we get to tell the adversary. We don't say, hey, so you broken in today. Our cover story is, no, it's what your deception is built in line with that you're trying to get them to believe on their own. And on top of that, generally the most convincing cover stories are based on what the opponent already believes and wants to believe. So the closer your cover story is to what the adversary thinks that they're getting themselves into, the more likely you are for success. And that's just basic human psychology. So how do we know what the adversary expects? Well, we're going to leverage the intelligence we've been building. The other thing we are probably doing with a cover story is dealing with limitations in what we can do. So you might want to build a deception environment that is the same size as your real IT network with as many fake users as you have on your real setup. If you have the same budget as your IT organization and the same budget to pay for all the people to sit there and type into your system, that's great. I want to come work for you, but I don't have that budget and nobody else does either. And so we need to account for why there might not be as many systems. So I'm going to look a little bit more at some of the techniques they've used as I develop my cover story and what I might need to fit into. So if we look again at Turla and how they do initial access, how they initially try to get into a network, we see they're doing things like drive-by compromise. They're infecting websites, they're setting them up so that if I visit them with a browser, they're getting into our system. They're doing things like spear phishing attachment. And they're just using valid accounts. They're logging in from the outside. So from a few of these, I can infer that Turla might be assuming that we have an email system. Again, fairly obvious, but it gives us information on how to build out, and that they're seeing end user systems, something you need for drive-by compromise or spear phishing attachment to actually succeed. I can go back to those discovery techniques, and I can see what sorts of things that they're actually digging for on the environment. So I see it they're looking at files. Okay, that's basically true of everything. They're looking at processes, looking at the registry. I see that they're doing remote system discovery and system network connection discovery. So remote system discovery means they're looking for other computers on the network that they've landed on. System network connection discovery, they're looking for connections out to other computers on that network from where they've landed. So we can probably infer from that that Turla is expecting multiple systems. They're doing a lot of digging to try to see what other computers are there. So let's start to build an example cover story. And again, I'm only looking at little pieces of this. A real cover story is going to be much more fleshed out than this. So, maybe we've built the ACME Corp. It's a small subsidiary of an existing company located in Kamana Bay. We'll call it DART. Has a dozen users, each with their own Windows desktop on a domain, has its own email and file servers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, trying to fit into our picture that we built up from our intelligence, at the same time accounting for our limited budget. We're a subsidiary, we're a smaller project, we're just a lab. Why is it that when Adversary targeted the bigger parent, they found themselves in the smaller space? And so this is our opportunity to explain that away. Our next step is that we need to determine how to actually sell that cover story to an adversary. So a deception environment you can think of like a movie set. Adversaries have very limited points of view in how they observe the environment they've landed in. All they've got is their command and control channel. Probably Cobalt Strike these days, but it could be a lot of different pieces of software out there. And so it's like a movie set. You've got the sets that you can build around where the adversary actually is in environment, and they've got their camera angles that they work through and perceive. And so they can't tell what's behind it if you've properly built the movie set. So I'm going to introduce another concept that's common from classical deception and how to do this, and that's a denial and deception methods matrix. And again, my friends from the Engage team recently put out a worksheet for actually doing denial and deception methods matrix. And so this is broken up into 4 quadrants. We first got deception objects. We've got facts, so the true things about our company and our environment. And we've got fictions, the lies that we're telling to an adversary. And we can do one of 2 things. We can either do deception or denial. Deception is where we are revealing and choosing to reveal that fact or fiction to an adversary. Denial is where we're concealing a fact or fiction from an adversary. So some of the types of facts that we might reveal to an adversary. Maybe we want to use the true network information about our company. So an adversary knows what our domain is. They know what our IP range is. Aaron tells them. And so maybe we don't have any reason to conceal that in our environment. We just want to show it. It adds to the realism, helps sell the story. Maybe we've got some information that we can add to it. Might already be public, that we can put into the system, let them steal, give them a warm fuzzy about their success without us actually having to lose anything. Another possible option, maybe we want to selectively remediate. We want to show them what it would truly look like if we were cleaning them out of a system to see how they react. And then there are the fictions we might want to reveal. So maybe we show them fake systems. We build out other computers in the environment to make it look bigger. We might give them fake information that fits into our cover story. There are facts that we might need to hide, like whatever software we have on the end system that's watching them. Maybe you want to call that something really benign running in the Windows processes. Works for them, we can use it too. And then conceal fictions is sort of the usually forgotten corner. It's things like the OPSEC around the deception, hiding that you're doing all of this stuff. And so then we want to fill this out to actually work with our cover story and the intelligence we have. So again, back to our discovery techniques. I'm going to start with focusing in on one of the 2 techniques I pointed out before, remote system discovery. So this is zoomed into the actual attack technique. It's again, they're looking for other local systems in the network. And so what are some fictions and facts that we can work with on this? Well, we can expose fake systems on the network. We can give them remote systems to discover. And we also don't want them to remotely discover our logging server. Whatever is collecting our PCAP, whatever is collecting our logs, we want to hide that from them doing this behavior. So system network connection discovery, finding out what local connections already exist on the end system. So we want to maybe create connections to a target host, let them find information to our fiction. And again, maybe we want to hide our logging system here. We've got a long-running connection to our logging system. We don't want them to find that when they're doing netstat, and so find ways to hide that. So we can go back and start adding each of these things we find to our denial and deception method matrix. We're building up a bigger and bigger picture that tells us exactly what we need to design. Now it's finally time to build it. So I talked in the beginning about we often see the cart before the horse in deception. People have a technical capability and they then try to backfill into it. This is where you get to start to play. So you're going to be implementing the denial and deception matrix in line with your cover story. You're going to design and build the revealed facts and fictions. You're going to build concealment around denied facts and fictions. And we're going to go a little bit deeper into how our adversary is operating, look at the procedures, because we want to even farther match adversary expectations in selling the story to them. So one of the two techniques I just used, remote system discovery. What is Turla actually doing? Well, in most cases, we see them actually just doing net view and net view domain. So they're looking at what systems have been seen in Windows browsing behavior. Okay, we can take that into account, and now we build our system. So I said we wanted to expose fake systems on a network or domain. They appear to expect NetView and NetView domain to show them something, and said, well, let's make that happen. And that might sound trivial, but it turns out if you build a Windows network from scratch, fresh Windows domain, you're building your brand new honeypot, your Windows 11, your current version of Windows Server, NetView might not actually do anything. It turns out a lot of the browse functionality that causes that to show information tends to come from cruft, from a network that was built, decade or decades ago. And so you actually have to go back and turn some of that on in Windows Server manually to start making it look like it's got that aged-in feel. Let's look at that other technique. So system network connection discovery. What are they actually doing here? Well, they're doing netstat-an. That in itself is a little bit interesting since most adversaries do netstat-ANO. NetUse, NetFile, NetSession, and they've got their own backdoors that are doing API calls with getTCP table. So a lot of different things to be able to see persistent connections that are on the end system. So we figured out that we wanted to create connections to the target host, but not have them see the connections to our logger. And they expect to see some number of these tools to actually work. So what can we do? So if we're able to create connections to some of our fake systems with NetUse, we can create something that actually will be seen by several of these tools. It shows up in the NetUse table. It shows up as a persistent TCP connection. And maybe we want to use something like UDP for logging. You get out of having that long-term persistent TCP connection off the system. Finally, time to have some fun, to deploy the deception. So if what you were trying to do here is to detect the adversary, it's time to put it out there in the wild. Put it out there for them to find, hopefully trip over, and set off an alert for you to respond to and deal with them being in your network. If your goal was intelligence gathering, it's time to wait for an opportunity. In most cases, sticking a honeypot just out there facing the internet doesn't usually catch the flies you really want. And so a lot of cases, it's looking for the right spearfish, the right website that's been infected to go visit and bring them into your space. Finally, this is all wasted effort, or might be wasted effort, if we're not actually gathering intelligence on our adversary. And that's no matter what type of deception you're trying to do here. If you're trying to detect the adversary, well, the main intelligence you probably want is, are they here or not? Yes or no? As well as sort of where they're coming from, anything else about them. And so you need your detection alerting capability. You need this going back to your SOC, setting off the flashing lights and warning bells, not just sitting there, hoping that something's going to happen and not actually watch it. We might be gathering what techniques are used by adversaries. Hopefully you share those back with ATT&CK. We'd really appreciate it. But doing things like hosting network monitoring, setting up maybe an EDR similar to what you have on the rest of your network, things like sysmon, looking at different processes being run. You might be getting into command and control decoding. Maybe you're able to decrypt the adversary's channels and actually watch over their shoulder as they operate. Any of these options, you might be able to gather a ton of information from an adversary. I've been focused completely on behaviors today. I haven't said a word about indicators of compromise, just been talking about how adversaries act, but fresh indicators of compromise can be extremely valuable, even if they're not in attack at all. So we use often David Bianco's pyramid of pain to discuss the value of different types of indicators, everything from how painful they are for an adversary to change. Starting with things like hash values, where an adversary can add a single bit to a file, completely change it. You'll never see the same hash again. IP addresses, where they can just switch to a new host. Domain names, they need to buy something, up through behaviors, which tend to be locked in over long periods of time. If you have the IP address of the command and control server that an adversary is using right now, though, that can save your bacon. It can be really important, even though it is a fairly fragile indicator. And then finally, we started off with gathering intelligence, figuring out who our priority adversary is, use this intelligence. So you saw them take a left, go through that door that you didn't plan on having the movie set behind. Well, okay, maybe that's where we focus our efforts next time. Make sure it looks better, or maybe make sure that door is closed next time. We can use that to build back and actually improve our deception each and every time we do this. Since the process I've just worked through, we're going from figuring out who our adversary is, building up intelligence on them, figuring out our cover story we want to tell them, figuring out what we're going to lie to the adversary about, what truths we're going to show them, build it out, put them in it, and gather our intelligence. So some takeaways are hopefully coming away from with this. We can take historical deception planning and apply it to cyber processes. We can use things that we already knew how to do and do cybersecurity a little bit better by using them. I hopefully convinced you that there's some value to cyber threat intelligence, some things we can do by actually knowing our adversaries, what sorts of things our adversaries do when they're in an environment. And so for both cyber deception and our general defense. And I'm using ATT&CK in a really strange way here compared with how a lot of companies are putting ATT&CK to use. And so hopefully demonstration of some ATT&CK uses beyond traditional defensive practices as well. That's me. That's where I am on social media. If anyone wants any stickers for ATT&CK, I've got them on the corner up here on the front table. And I've got a couple minutes for questions, I believe. Dead silence. Carlotta.
Yell it out.
I'll repeat the question for the streaming.
That works. What size organization effectively?
So Carla's question was, what size organization do we see effectively using this? It depends. So things like honey tokens, really simple deceptive practices like putting fake information in systems, we see from all sorts of size companies. We do see organizations that really have their act together, want to take it another step, and that's where they're getting into. A lot of the more building out large-scale deception environments, anyone can technically do it, but the intelligence necessary to maintain that, the different types of roles you need to actually be able to monitor and build it, do tend to come from larger, more resourced organizations. And so one of the reasons why I brought up Engage at the beginning is Engage actually has a broad set of options, broader than sort of the really deep planning I'm doing today, that smaller companies may also be able to bring to bear. Anyone else? Right? Well, thank you very much, Cayman.